Good to be with all of you this morning. It's an exciting conversation that has been started this morning. And I'm very interested from our guests, and I'm going to get straight to delivering on the promise here, and that's the description that has been laid out in front of us. And I'd like to first get a sense from each one of you, what is the state of global business of waterfronts? What is, and specific to the financial health of them as a financial engine, as providing revenue, as providing jobs? First, I'm going to ask you to give me a number from 1 to 10, 10 being good, and then explain why. So I'll just start directly to my left. Ken, what's your thought?
It's a difficult question. I would say that the financial strength of waterfronts is between 1 and 10.
Well, I will. You're the perfect guest.
Simply because the situation varies so differently around the world. You know, as you think about in this panel title is the word global, and global always invites you to think big. So you have a situation which is driven by 4 different considerations, really. One is climate change, of course.
Sure.
And second would be the economic rise and fall of economies. And we've already had, I think Judith made the point that urbanization in the future will be very concentrated in Asia, South Asia, and Africa, Latin America, probably to some extent. Those economies, as they rise, they shift the local strengths of ports and logistics facilities very dramatically. I mean, the world's biggest port now is Shanghai International Port. A generation ago, it barely existed. So you can see how quickly that change takes place. The third really is technology change. There's a lot to be said about that, but we're thinking ahead to envision 2060, and that's 47 years ahead, 43 years ahead, right? If you think back 43 years, you're about 1974. Think of what we thought about technology in those days. 1974 was the year, I think, that On the Waterfront, Marlon Brando's On the Waterfront was produced. It was 10 years before 1984,
right.
You know, to Judith's discussion of dystopia and big data. It was also a time when ship containerization was just getting started. And so you still had, in many ports around the world, you still had ships docking, ramps being laid down, people running up and down ramps with bales of cotton, corn.
Well, what year are you looking at for in terms of a key benchmark? 2060, as you said, is a couple days away. What year are you looking at?
Well, what I'm thinking is this. I don't say this to sort of cast a negative shadow over the idea of looking ahead, but I think it boils down to 2 things. You need to think very boldly, and you've got to be very open-minded in thinking of what happened, what will happen. If in 1975 you told this audience that today, 43 years ahead, a lot of their workday would be spent with a laptop.
Yeah.
They would have thought, well, what does that mean? It means I'm going to be sitting down. I have a laptop.
Yeah.
A cell phone. What is a cell phone? What does it mean? I can remember the CEO of Coopers & Lybrand standing up in the 1990s and saying...
When there was Coopers & Lybrand.
When there was a Coopers & Lybrand. And he said that he had fought fiercely against the idea of giving PCs and laptops to auditors because he just couldn't see how useful they could be, things of that sort. Shipping in those days was just beginning containerization, as I said. Air travel, just to think about the scope of changes that ports looking for sustainability and resilience need to face.
Right.
Air travel in those days, to go from North America to Asia was about a 2.5-day trip.
So are you looking at 10 years ahead then? You're saying 5 years? Because you're saying 2060 is way in front of us.
I'm looking really I mean, you can look at the 43 years, you can look at 20 years, you can look at 5 years. I'm thinking more in terms of 20 years. But I just say one thing about air travel, because it's a great analogy for what we're talking about today. Used to fly from New York to L.A., L.A. to Honolulu, Honolulu to Guam, Guam to Tokyo, say, for example, if you wanted to go from North America to Asia. That long trip gave rise to a vast infrastructure, not a vast, but a substantial infrastructure investment by the federal government in what was called the East-West Center in Honolulu. You probably have heard about this.
I've been there, yes, right.
And the idea of the East-West Center is people would never travel, leaders would never, business leaders, government leaders, academic leaders would never travel between North America and Asia without spending a night in Honolulu. Technology change, kind of small one in aircraft, opened the polar routes.
Yeah, 747, 787.
Changed that trip from 2.5 days to 13 hours. Now, the analogy is shipping companies now, this is something that we talked about, Tom and I talked about a little bit before. Shipping companies are thinking about climate change. They're looking at what kind of benefits might ensue from climate change. And one might be the opening up of polar routes for shipping, which would actually cut the time from Asia to North America in half. In half. That would have an enormous impact on what ports become viable.
Interesting.
So it's a good example of an external fact, an external development, which is very difficult to predict,
right.
Having a major impact on the future of these kinds of.
I want to get to Roland. 1 to 10. What's the state? And we'll speak to what you know really well right now, which is New York. Yeah. 1 to 10, and then why?
Well, it's 7.2 actually.
7.2, I like that. All right, an exacting individual.
And the bill that what Ken was just saying a minute ago, if I can sort of paraphrase the great business analyst and urbanologist Yogi Berra, predictions are very hard, especially about the future.
Right,
indeed.
Right.
So I'll talk just a little bit about global, but really focus on New York, which is what I do best.
Sure.
There's been a tremendous consolidation of the shipping industry, which is happening still. There's fewer and fewer. There may be even a further consolidation of the stevedores, the places where they unload their goods here in our harbor. Mm-hmm. So there is a dynamic shift, as you're just saying. One of climate change's unintended or one of the consequences is the possibility of a polar route to New York City, which would this port is growing, and it has the benefit of having a huge market right here, and so it's not going anywhere. We're I think we are the third largest port in the United States, and creeping towards number 2 or perhaps number 1 in the not too distant future.
You're doing a great job.
What's that?
I said you're doing a great job.
No problem. Yeah. You're welcome.
Yeah. Thank you.
So the good things that gets us to 7.2
right.
are the increase of rail connection to the hinterlands. Mm-hmm. The fact that these the interesting dynamic that there are greater cargo and fewer calls. So the larger ships. That's why there will be I think a consolidation internally. There's only 5 if you count. 2 owned by the same company, facilities that receive the goods, stevedores. But there's probably going to be a struggle as as they reduce down, possibly down to 3 or 4. So the advent
less better or less worse.
Less is probably better, although there's choke points now.
Yeah.
One of the even though rail connection is increasing, we are still tremendously dependent on highway transit to move goods. So I think on the previous panel, Andrew was talking about short sea shipping, where part of our harbor was named a part of the sea highway, the National Maritime Highway. Getting trucks off of I-95 and moving up and down, perhaps from Baltimore and roll off to New York or beyond, is a point of growth. So just to wrap up, the optimism I see is that this port can grow more, can do great environmental benefit as we grow more by getting more trucks off the road. There are, again, in the previous panel mentioned, I think briefly, the virtual city that's being built out in the ocean now to combat global warming. So that is a point of possible growth for our port to support that. Other things that can happen, we talked a lot about Brooklyn Bridge Park before. There's a highway right above the Brooklyn Bridge Park that needs to be dismantled and rebuilt. Moving all that material, the demolition off, moving the goods to rebuild it on via water. Mm-hmm. So thinking creatively how we can use this resource, this great port, and maintaining the working waterfront, the support industries, that the tug barges, the ship repairs. We lost a couple of points because we paved over one of the ship repair facilities in Red Hook, one of the few we have. So
hate when that happens.
Yeah, it did happen. It was a defeat.
I don't know what happened. Yeah, just we
made an extra.
The map was wrong.
No, a couple extra parking spots for IKEA, and I love IKEA as much as the next guy, but didn't have to happen.
Fantastic. Talking about big boxes, right? Bill, so building on that, 1 to 10, and why?
I'm going to stick with the same scoring. I think we're a 7 to 8, but you know, you just mentioned the preserving the land piece. Baltimore is an interesting example where we saw industry die.
Yeah.
And the inner harbor that many of you have been to was converted into a tourism industry, which is now our 3rd largest industry.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
The port now has grown back, and we are acquiring more property in order to grow the port. So we gave up property to create a tourist district, and now we're out reclaiming more property in order to expand the port, which is the 4th fastest growing port in
Did you know that going into that, as you were putting that together, that one's going to beget the other, this nice little cycle, because it has been discussed in somewhat binary terms, one or the other. But in your case, you're saying one gets the other, and they feed each other.
Well, I think back then, the leaders in Baltimore in the late 70s were looking at a shrinking industry, a steel manufacturing town that was losing business rapidly. We had Sparrows Point, the old Bethlehem Steel, with 50,000 employees. You know, you had a blue-collar town that suddenly the jobs were fleeing, and government officials were looking at ways to replace those jobs. So they said, well, let's do the next best thing and let's create tourism-related industry.
Right.
And that's worked well. We've got 23 million visitors coming to Baltimore. The inner harbor is great.
Why does one feed the other? Why does that work?
Well, I think...
What's the magic there? What's the secret sauce?
I mean, for us, we converted a destination. We bought 2,000 properties in the middle of downtown and dedicated it to creating this district. But at the same time, we're now struggling with some of the after effects of that and the gentrification that happened around the water, eating away at deepwater access. Deepwater access, of course, is needed for those big ships to come in, and we're now looking at dredging channels. And the big pinch point we have that wasn't mentioned is double stacking of freight cars, and we have a number of issues in the Mid-Atlantic. But Baltimore is a big choke point right now, so we're working on fixing a 120-year-old tunnel. Which is not an easy thing that runs right through the middle of downtown. So, you know, the tourism industry did great, and now all of a sudden we've got this growing port. We're the #1 in the country in roll-on, roll-off. So most of the cars that you're driving, if you have one, have come in through the Port of Baltimore. Container is growing, but the reality is we have to make certain that we have preserved enough land. The Port of Baltimore just went and acquired hundreds of acres of privately owned land, and the old Sparrows Point Bethlehem Steel has been razed and converted into a huge logistics hub with FedEx and Amazon and Under Armour all opening massive distribution warehouses there.
To the panel, did you want to say something?
Just real quick, I just want to add what Bill's struggling with here. It's the same thing here in New York. Every coast can be a Gold Coast. I could imagine condominiums on Newark Bay, in the inconceivable future. So preserving what they're struggling to do there is the same thing what I was talking about with the IKEA parking lot on top of the graving dock. Making sure that those critical maritime uses for the economy, for shipping, for global transit, and for the environment. That if those roll-on, roll-off facilities weren't there, they'd be trucking those cars up and down the coast and further congesting. So it's good for the environment, good for jobs, and it's really incumbent upon all of us to protect those not a lot, but those critical maritime resources.
So the interesting thing for lay people like myself looking at waterfront, the business of waterfronts, is the heat map of the dollars that come in. And typically it is a very bright red just around the waterfront, and then as you move inland it's almost no red. How important is it that these dollars, the money that comes in, does see a little bit of a hue of red a mile in, 2 miles in, 5 miles in from waterfronts? And how do you discuss that idea of localized revenue staying in that very community in the health of the financial future for waterfronts? How important is that criterion? Anybody?
Let me take a shot at that from a slightly different angle, which I did already in the first question, but I'll admit to it.
Swing again.
It sort of depends really on where investment dollars come from and what their goal is. One of the unique lessons from Asia, especially from China and its very rapid development, is you have massive resources available for infrastructure investment and essentially for shaping communities that try to be living communities in any particular place. So the government mobilizes the investment money. They mobilize this investment money actually typically way ahead of demand. So they will create, for example, in a city like Beijing, they add 100 kilometers of subway a year. They decide where there's space available, whether it's waterfront space or not. They make that space available, accessible, with light rail or subway investment. And then property developers, also generally borrowing from the state banks, will come in and build residential property and attempt to build commercial property and all the services that are needed to create a living community. So planning plays a very, very big role in this. And one of the characteristics about it that I think has been very successful, that gives us a sort of takeaway in terms of how investment, whether it's public or public-private or private, is that this investment is way ahead of demand. It's way ahead of demand. The bad effect on the balance sheet is it creates a lot of debt in the economy,
Welfare
which of course
paradox.
is a kind of crisis.
Yeah.
On the other hand, with things developing so quickly around the world today, so very quickly, the infrastructure is there when the demand rises. It's a very different model from the way we think about everything. But so far it's been extraordinarily successful.
You have to have the muscle set, because when the opportunity is there, you got to jump, and that's what you're talking about.
And quite specifically, even double-height containers, China's rail system, a lot of it built in the Northeast by the Japanese, would only accommodate single height. But it wasn't a great problem for the government to mobilize the resources to change that quickly.
And I bring up that question, that question of the heat map, because folks are going to be voting for these sorts of things. Investments in infrastructure, development of waterfronts, are the folks living in these spaces? That's why I'm asking this.
Yeah, I think it depends. There's a nuanced answer to that. You think of a cruise terminal. Would that shouldn't it have a lot of heat map or multiplier effect? Doesn't. Because the cruise industry wants you in there, on the boat, getting out on the boat, and spending your money on the boat. And it's famously not, and I think it's important to the larger economy of the city. Whereas, a tug operation, they've got to get their vehicles and engines repaired. There's all sorts of multiplier effects. The guys that work there will go out and get their lunches up. The ferries that was mentioned earlier, new industry in New York, are burgeoning, as we've had a lot to do with that locally. Are creating new nodes of destinations where people are going to or exploring different neighborhoods and that sort of thing. Again, great multiplier effect. The shipping industry at large creates great multiplier with accountants and all sorts of back office folks that work, and truckers, of course, to get the stuff out. So and photographers,
helicopters, big business.
So anyway, unfortunately, it depends. There's many varieties. But what I often like to make the point when I have the opportunity to, and this is an opportunity, is that whether it's the harbor school or a restaurant or a tug operation or a major shipper, there is such a variety. You think of that waterfront as a job generator, and it's hundreds of thousands of jobs. But people don't think of it that way. If I said to the audience right now, Wall Street was closing, we'd be running to grab the last muffin and panicking, right? That's core to the self-identity of New York. We say the port's closing. All right, but there's
the port is closing. Any responses?
We'll get our goods.
They're all laughing. Yeah, so
we'll get our good bits of both. But the jobs that we lost would be the same. Would rival that of the financial industry's contracting or closing. So it's a perception.
It's a good point. It's there, but we don't see it. Right. Bill, reflect on that. Also, I'm going to add another thing to this. What's the number or the criterion to watch to understand the health, the financial health of waterfronts? I'm going to add that in just to help me, if you will, understand what to look for. What's a number or something I can watch?
I think it's jobs. I'll go back to follow. It's jobs and jobs created. There are so many direct jobs to the port, and then the indirect jobs, the multiplier of those jobs. And so you talked about that heat map, and I was sitting here thinking we did a regional plan for sustainable development in Baltimore, and one of the things we studied were jobs that had low-skill jobs that you could get on the job training that had great vertical advancement and provided a family-sustaining wage. And almost half the jobs in the region were at the port.
Really?
They were logistics. They were everything you can imagine port-related. So if you looked at those jobs and you thought STEM education, you looked at...
So these are middle-class jobs is what you're telling me?
These are middle-class jobs that provided a high wage or salary that were family-sustaining. and that you could start as a level 1 and move all the way up without having to change
Level
careers.
1, you get benefits?
You could, yeah, in a lot of these fields. So we studied 50 different careers, and half of those were directly related to the port. So for me, I look at the job creation.
Right.
The other piece of that is we've had, you know, a lot of our waterfront development has come at great expense. It's expensive. We've got a lot of parts right now that have been developed for things other than deep water port-related activities. One of the things that just happened is Under Armour's world headquarters is moving from one side of the harbor to the other. We just approved the largest TIF, I believe, in the country's history at $660 million to ensure that that entire port area is developed around the Under Armour campus.
Talking about voting.
And created the largest community benefits agreement in the city's history to ensure that not only jobs and affordable housing were part of the plan.
What's the net positive on jobs you got there?
It'll be 25,000 jobs over the next 20 years.
How about to date?
Well, we've got Under Armour's got 3,500 jobs in Baltimore today, and as they relocate and expand, they'll continue to grow. But they're bringing other companies with them. So,
what are they doing? The logistics?
No, it's most of theirs is their headquarters. They're doing light manufacturing now in Baltimore.
Oh, light okay, great. At this location you're talking about. All right, great. So I want to get a sense here, if I can here, Ken. What's the number you're watching? How do I understand? He's saying jobs.
Yeah.
The health of waterfronts financially. What should I watch?
Again, it sort of depends on the sort of policy and practices of the economy you're talking about.
We'll say New York.
I wouldn't venture to guess. I'm not going to venture to guess in front of Roland here. Creation in New York. But you know, there are different measures of success. Jobs is one. In Asia, jobs are important, but they're not a primary measure of success. The sort of sustainability of a region or a locale really is an important measure. And the way that would work is something like this, because this builds essentially on what Roland was saying. In China, one of the major centrally planned projects, centrally financed projects, was a huge port facility north of Tianjin called Caofeidian. And because of the planning capability and investment capability of the government, this massive investment was complete in all respects. The idea was that a very large port would be built for bulk inbound shipments. Added to that would be a container facility for outbound shipments. Capital Steel, one of the nation's biggest steel producers, was simply moved from north of Beijing to Caofeidian. So they were moved into this huge development zone that the government was creating. The government set aside a large chunk of land there for post-mill fabricators and a whole bunch of downstream product developers. So the idea is that entire community is created through planning and investment. The idea is iron ore comes in from Australia or some of the iron ore sourcing countries, maybe Brazil. It is converted to steel. It is rolled by fabricators. It is built into washing machines and refrigerators. It's put on container ships and it's shipped to America. So the advantage of that is it creates a large number of jobs. And it does it in two ways. One, by creating enormous efficiencies in terms of the transportation, the location of workers, the availability of land at subsidized prices, the availability of energy at subsidized prices. But at the bottom of it all is it creates incredible export competitiveness because that model is so efficient. But you can do that centrally planning. But the story is it hasn't worked very well.
Why?
Why it hasn't worked very well? Yeah. I don't know. Something we think about and study, but you know, it's hard to do that.
Right.
It's a great idea, money's there, hard to make it work. So that's something I think we're going to learn as we watch the competitiveness in these macro regions around the world sharpen and intensify.
All right, great. So I understand what one criterion that you're bringing up here is the export strength of that particular market and what it might bring to. That's one thing you're watching. Okay, good point. What's the success criterion?
Well, you know, certainly jobs and throughput, the traditional. You know, how much stuff is coming in and how many jobs are created. But I think you know, as touched on this before, and I want to echo something Bill said a minute ago. How many fewer cars and trucks are coming into your, you know, what's the environmental benefit? What's the economic benefit by reduced congestion on your roads? You don't have to repair it with those 18-wheelers going back and forth as much. So thinking about those sort of tangential, but I think very important benefits and monetizing those are really important to value the port. But again, I want to just echo.
How do you measure that, by the way? I mean, how do you get? Normally, if you do what the success criterion means, if you achieve a higher mark, you get some return. How do you get a return at managing the port?
Well, I think I don't have the numbers at the top of my head, but the city of New York has done that actually for talking about what when they barge things from the port of Newark to Brooklyn and offload here. They've said that X number of thousands of hundreds of thousands of truck miles have been taken off, and they've made a calculation of how many percents that reduces the maintenance of the highway across Staten Island. So it can be done, and it is done, and it should be publicized and thought about as public policymakers make those decisions. The thing that the TIF for the Under Armour I think is so important, and this sort of marries the first panel and us a little bit. We have a 21st century waterfront. As I was saying before, the working harbor, which we're focusing on, takes little, but we have the inner harbor, we have Brooklyn Bridge Park, we have Governor's Island, we have so many amazing new facilities, and people are enjoying it, making it that livability thing that's so important for world cities to compete against each other. And we have the greatest harbor in the world, and people are enjoying it in more different ways, but it costs money to maintain it.
Yeah.
And in Brooklyn Bridge Park, they have a cross-subsidy. They're fortunate enough to have luxury condominiums that can and a market for it. Not true at every linear mile, that 520 miles of waterfront. So finding ways to finance and govern these waterfronts in these cities is probably the unanswered question right now. We used to have it was very simple when industry owned and used the waterfront for commerce, they paid for it. Now we have all other finding those TIFs or other ways to maintain those bulkheads, build those piers. That are
dredge those channels.
Dredge those channels that are necessary for a marina or for moving goods.
So you're all the big brains when it comes to business at waterfronts. Tell me an idea that you've thought about, but you don't want to say out loud because I'll think you're crazy. About what will really change things when we look at waterfronts and the way that the way they operate financially would really be like a grand slam. But you don't want to say it out loud because people think you're crazy, but not here because we think you're great.
We already know we're crazy, right?
Yeah. Who wants to go first? Something innovative, something just like wow, he's crazy.
It's the old as dirt.
Yeah.
It's the Erie Canal. It's moving goods by water. Moving your FedEx package comes in by to Newark or JFK. Get that thing. Not on a little truck, but on a little boat that runs to port facilities. Or your apples come down from upstate New York. Get them on a barge coming down the river. Get that marine highway moving locally, moving our good. I think there's a revolution happening right now with the ferries.
That's really interesting with the ferries, and it's so romantic too. Right. It is really really cool stuff.
Use the same fleet to move goods at night. When you move people by the day and the goods by night. Why not?
There you go. Use the same very same vehicles, right? And I'll build on what you said earlier here, and that is, if we have the 787s and the A350s that are going point to point, yet we're talking about mega ports, and I'm going to build on your idea there. Why don't we have the 787s and A350s for goods in multiple ports instead of it going to a mega port? Help me out.
Well, I mean, a lot of what you're describing actually, I think, exists in Hong Kong. A pretty tight integration between long shipping and then local shipping. In Shanghai, there's a whole river port development facility that complements goods coming in and out of the Shanghai port. So that's been a really important part of the development. Yangtze River is quite unique. It's the only sort of inland navigable river with any length in China. But again, part of the investment strategy in countries that are investing way ahead of demand is that all three pieces fit together: ports and then rail to distribute out of the ports in pretty much the way that Roland is talking about, and then airports. This absorbs most of the infrastructure investment in these economies that are command economies. And that works out very well because it permits concentration. I mean, look, we're moving toward concentration for a couple of reasons. And one of the things that in a sense, is problematic for job creation is that ports are going to be automated. You know, they're going to be automated. I mean, the whole progress I started by just...
How many jobs are you seeing losing by automation? I'm sorry to interrupt.
Again, I can't even estimate it, but I can only say if you think back to people loading bales of cotton by hand to containers, and then even the crane operators of containers are being replaced by automation. And in fact, these transits will be driverless.
Right.
And so you're going to have consolidation of the companies, and you're going to have value chain consolidation as well. So the FedExes and the UPSs and the Maersks and the APLs, they're going to become essentially one big set of companies, maybe 2 or 3 globally competing with each other. And that means that they're going to do everything to take costs out.
Is this good?
Of supply. Well, it's good in terms of the efficiency of transportation and logistics, and even the profitability of ports. It's not so good in terms of employment, I would have to say.
Yeah, but for waterfront cities and their economies, is it good for them?
It's too complicated a calculus for me to...
That may be a no.
Reduce it to that question.
maybe
I think it's inevitable. That's the problem.
Crazy idea.
Again, you have probably better ideas than I have.
Well, those driverless cars have to come somewhere, and they're still going to roll in on Baltimore's port, so we'll take them.
Right.
Well, hopefully they'll be made in the States.
I mean, I'm a big believer that we can actually increase export in this country significantly.
Yeah, good.
Brookings...
How much?
I don't have a number, but Brookings and J.P. Morgan Chase have spent a lot of time over the last couple of years with this Global Cities Initiative. Baltimore has been a partner in that, and we look at the lost small and medium business opportunity that fail to understand their export capabilities. And as we try to gin up that engine and get people exporting, I think you can actually increase demand for our port.
Single digits is probably what you're thinking year over year.
But you know, it could have a significant impact on local economies of urban areas as their small and medium-sized business understand that they have a global market now. And many just don't understand that capacity exists.
Is one of the things about ports, you know, where you travel, so Singapore was brought up a little bit earlier. I grew up in San Francisco, another port city that just is dead now. Guangzhou, you pick your port city. You've been to all of them, I think, that I'm going to bring up. But they're always over on the side. How important is that they become part of the visual landscape so that we understand that togetherness of what a waterfront means to a local economy, to a regional economy? Because it's always like, oh, it's over there. Like, you know, in Singapore, for instance, used to be busiest port, right? Or still is. Number 1, number 2? 3? I mean, we can argue, I'm sure, about...
It's down there at 3 or 4 now.
Okay, number 4 or 5.
Yeah.
But it's way off on the side, despite it being, you know, when it was number 1, I was living there, it was way... You never know that, except when you were flying in, you'd see all the container ships.
Yeah. Well, that's a great question, and I think we have a tremendous amount to learn, actually, from looking at a small group of Asian ports, including Singapore. That have had different fates, even though they've had sort of similar natural endowments. And I would put in that group for study purposes Shanghai, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Guangzhou. Because the pace of change there has been very, very dramatic. I mean, Hong Kong benefited enormously. Hong Kong ports benefited enormously from the early rise of China. But now, unfortunately, China's reached a stage where Hong Kong is shrinking quickly and Guangzhou has overtaken Hong Kong in terms of tonnage. Shanghai, the biggest port in the world, can't develop like Singapore is developing because of its lack of integration into the landscape. And I don't mean just the physical landscape, I mean the policy landscape, the monetary policy landscape, the currency landscape, the capital controls landscape, all of these things that make Singapore unable to do, make Shanghai unable to do what Singapore is doing. So Singapore emerges as a kind of a winner, and the reason is actually Singapore did integrate their early success with shipping with financial services that were wrapped around that industry, including insurance.
That's their business model.
Insurance, investment, leasing, and everything else. So even if the physical port activity, in a sense, kind of stabilizes, they are the major financial centers. So Singapore is actually doing better than Hong Kong at the moment in that respect. I got
to move the Q&A, but I want the two of you to reflect on the idea of making it part of my neighborhood.
Very briefly, I think it's the most critical question of all. Because there's a political underlying reality to it. If it's out of mind and out of sight to voters, politicians don't think about it, and decisions get made that hurt Maritime and Important.
Yeah.
So I would say, the intellectual idea of this bottle of water, this chair, it came by a boat.
Yeah.
The clothes I'm wearing came by a boat.
Right.
Having people being that our life is based on commerce as much as it was in Henry Hudson's or Columbus days. Number one. Number two, finding ways to open the doors. We still have them there. You have it on the Brooklyn, in Staten Island. Take down the fences. Let us see the tug operations. Open the doors. Let us view them as the ship repairs. See, it's still going on out there, but there's corrugated metal. And the last thing, just real brief, put on some show. Where I worked, Fulton Fish Market used to be down there in Seaport.
Yeah.
Bring down, it's in the Bronx now, bring down a boat with fish.
Well, you remember George Lucas and the Landwalkers, right? You know where he got that idea from the Landwalkers. His daughter saw the Port of Oakland and saw the container cranes and said, "Dad, look at that." And that's where they got the Landwalkers for Return of the Jedi. Maybe that's what you do, huh? I don't know.
And tall ships and anything maritime, including ferries, get people connected to the water.
They're fun stuff. They're fun stuff.
So I am a recovering elected official, and
all right, out.
Having represented the Port of Baltimore at the state level and at the local level, and I will tell you that working ports and residential communities don't mix very well.
Yeah.
And even office communities and working ports don't mix very well because the noise, trains, trucks, those freight cranes, they all don't mix well. So you're never going to be able to integrate them in the middle of a vibrant urban community without dealing with the stuff that elected officials don't want to have to.
But airports do well. They're like sexy. They're new buildings and.
I don't know many people. We have a lawsuit right now at BWI, Baltimore Washington International Airport, because they changed the flight path, and everybody now in the new flight path is suing the state, and in turn the state has sued the FAA to go back to the old flight path. So you got to be a little bit careful in how close you put those uses, because we've dealt with it, and we had to create some favorable zoning in Baltimore to protect the port against these types of frivolous claims.
Mixed use. I know that was brought up as one of the days to make it more integrated. Q&A? We'll start with the left and then you. So we'll start all the way in the back left.
Thank you all for a very stimulating panel. Tom Harrington with the Urban Coast Institute at Monmouth University. I had a question about, you all mentioned kind of these external influences that may shape the port of the future that we may not be viewing now as what the port is. And in light of these kind of changes and what we've been doing with our industrial waterfronts in terms of redevelopment, do we have the capacity to actually host offshore wind energy port and harbor facilities? Are those spaces available that are important for our future in terms of working waterfront, but we may have not considered? And how would we plan for that?
Great question. Why don't we go and get a twofer, and they can react to both questions. You raised your hand there? Yep.
Okay, so separately, hi, I'm Josh Glasser. I'm a senior at Cornell University in urban planning. And I guess this question is for Bill and then for the rest of the panel as well, but specifically talking about Port Covington, the $660 million TIF. I'm curious, how do you at BDC kind of think about, you talked about jobs, but how do you think about the other impacts for all of Baltimore and not just those that are employed?
I guess we could probably have a separate panel on tax increment financing. Those are fun and stimulating conversations. We can talk afterwards. But obviously, one of the things you're trying to do, when you talk about subsidizing, and a TIF, for those of you who don't know, takes the tax increment that's generated from the development project and plows it back into the debt service needed to do the public infrastructure improvements. So the company itself doesn't benefit, but you're paying for the public infrastructure required to do the horizontal development. That's the way at least we use it in Baltimore under the law. Obviously, the education process for doing something like that is significant because the general sentiment is you're taking our tax dollars and you're giving it to a private developer for that project, when in fact, the tax dollars wouldn't be generated without the project. So you have a but-for analysis and you go through all that. In that case, we know we're going to generate far more tax dollars to benefit the general fund while also growing both Under Armour and Port Covington at the same time. And that's why the Community Benefits Agreement came along, because the communities that were immediately impacted by this project needed to feel as if they were getting something very tangible out of the project, in addition to just the increased tax revenue from Port Covington. So we can talk offline, but it was a very complicated debate. Obviously, when you're trying to create infrastructure for 265 acres that doesn't have any, and you have no capital budget at local government to pay for it, you have to find creative financing tools, and TIP was our tool. I'll let the other two answer the first question.
I can go after wind.
Please, and quickly.
Wind power, I think it brings to mind the idea that the flexibility of maritime facilities are so important, and also sometimes threatened. You have what's called SBMT on the Brooklyn waterfront. It joins Andrew's huge facility at Industry City, and that is a perfect and probably the best staging area for the construction of. But it's not there. It's not there. It's by accident. The city has invested a lot of money to dredge and improve that, and now it's there and ready for the wind power as it's emerging. Another facility, which was more of a question mark right now, but equally important, a little place called Miller's Launch. It's a tug, and you sort of think of it as the Swiss Army knife of the working waterfront out there in Staten Island. There's huge development on the North Shore of Staten Island, residential and commercial, that are, and the future of this facility is open. But it's equally important to service the many needs that will happen as the wind farms are developed out there in the ocean. So preserving these precious maritime facilities for the future, for needs that are now and needs that will come up in the future, is so critical. That's the takeaway.
With Tom standing up, that means that we're going to have to cut it short. But as Tom knows, I like to do this thing called a lightning round, which takes about 2 minutes. And I'm going to say as much as I want, and you only can say one word. All right? I can say as much as I want.
7.2.
Yeah, that's right. But you only can say one word. So that's why it's lightning. It just whatever comes to mind. Whatever comes to mind.
See, I don't know it's 3 words.
That's okay. I'll point to you, and you just have to react. Polar routes.
Viable.
The future.
I'll rely on these guys.
What do you look for when you're walking through a waterfront? What do you look at first?
Gosh, I look at the water.
Water.
Access.
Ships.
Okay. Jobs, workforce.
Threatened.
Critical.
Yeah, the most important part.
Market demand for healthy waterfronts.
Critical.
Very high.
Off the charts.
Off the charts. That's good. What is, when you look at the New York port, what is its state of health?
Improving.
Improving.
I'll go with the expert. Improving.
Environmental impact.
Positive.
Most important.
Yeah, important.
Great. And finally, I'll finish with this, the future of the working waterfront.
Optimistic.
Critical.
Bright.
Right. Okay, thank you all three. I appreciate it. Thank you.